Number 1. John Jones. John Jones. The name alone commands respect in the world of mixed martial arts. Widely considered one of the greatest fighters to ever step into the Octagon, a former light heavyweight champion with a record that seemed untouchable. But imagine being at the absolute peak of your profession, admired by millions, and throwing it all away in a single moment of reckless decision-making. This is the story of how a champion's choices outside the cage nearly destroyed everything he'd built inside it. Before we dive into the incident that changed everything, let's understand who John Jones was. Born in 1987 in Rochester, New York, Jones came from an athletic family. His brothers both played in the NFL, but John found his calling in mixed martial arts. By his early 20s, he was already making waves in the UFC. In 2011, at just 23 years old, he became the youngest champion in UFC history. His fighting style was innovative, his reach was incredible, and his dominance seemed absolute. Fans called him unstoppable. Sponsors lined up. The future looked limitless. But success in the spotlight can be a dangerous thing, especially when personal demons lurk beneath the surface. Jones had already faced scrutiny for a 2012 incident involving a collision with a pole, and whispers about his lifestyle choices had begun to circulate. Still, nothing prepared the world for what would happen on April 26, 2015, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of quiet time when most people are just starting their day. Pregnant mother Vanessa Sonier was stopped at a red light, waiting for it to change. Suddenly, a rented SUV ran the red light and smashed into her vehicle. The impact was jarring, airbags deployed, and Sonier found herself in shock and pain. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. The driver of that SUV didn't stay to help. Instead, he fled the scene on foot. Witnesses watched in disbelief as the man ran from his vehicle, leaving an injured pregnant woman behind. But the story doesn't end there. About 5 minutes later, the same man returned to the crash site. Was he coming back to check on the victim? To take responsibility? No. He reached into the SUV, grabbed something, and fled again. That something, a large amount of cash and what appeared to be a pipe. The investigation moved quickly. Police found the rental agreement in the abandoned SUV, and the name on it sent shockwaves through the sports world: John Jones. Inside the vehicle, officers discovered bottles containing substances later confirmed through testing. The evidence was mounting, but Jones had vanished. For an entire day, one of the most recognizable athletes in the world was nowhere to be found. When he finally turned himself in the following day, the damage was done. The image of an invincible champion had cracked wide open. The charges were serious, leaving the scene of an accident involving injury, a felony in New Mexico. Imagine being Vanessa Sonier in that moment, injured and alone, watching the person responsible simply run away. The legal system now had to determine what consequences Jones would face. The UFC acted swiftly, stripping Jones of his light heavyweight title and suspending him indefinitely. Sponsors dropped him. The fall from grace was spectacular and public. Jones's legal team went to work, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses had seen everything. The rental agreement was ironclad, and Jones himself eventually admitted to his actions, though the circumstances of his statements would later become points of contention. In September 2015, Jones entered a guilty plea. The judge had to balance the severity of leaving an injured pregnant woman with Jones's status as a first-time felony offender. The prosecution pushed for accountability, emphasizing the callousness of fleeing not once but twice. The sentence came down with mixed reactions. Jones received 18 months of supervised probation, with the condition being that if he completed it successfully without any violations, the felony would be reduced to a misdemeanor. He was also required to make public service appearances, speaking to young people about making better choices. Some felt the sentence was too lenient, pointing out that an ordinary person might have faced harsher consequences. Others argued that the public humiliation and career damage Jones suffered constituted its own form of punishment. Vanessa Sonnier, the victim, spoke about her lasting injuries and the trauma of being abandoned in her moment of need. Jones completed his probation, and the felony was indeed reduced as promised. But the incident became a defining moment in his career, one that would be referenced again and again in the years that followed. He would face additional controversies, further complicating his legacy. As of today, Jon Jones has returned to fighting and even captured another championship, but the question remains whether he can ever fully escape the shadow of that April morning. This case reminds us that talent and success don't grant immunity from consequences. Jon Jones had everything, and in the span of minutes, he jeopardized it all. The choice to flee, to prioritize self-preservation over helping someone in need, revealed something about character that no championship belt could ever hide. And perhaps that's the lasting lesson here. Greatness in one arena doesn't guarantee integrity in another. Number 2, Jorge Masvidal. Jorge Masvidal. To UFC fans, the name evokes images of spectacular knockouts, the famous three-piece and a soda line, and the resurrection of a career that seemed to be fading. Gamebred, they called him, a fighter known for his street mentality and willingness to throw down anywhere, anytime. But imagine taking that fighter's mindset outside the controlled environment of the Octagon into a scenario where there are no referees, no rules, and no one to stop what happens next. This is the story of how Masvidal's street justice mentality led him into a courtroom facing serious felony charges. Before the incident that would land him in legal trouble, Jorge Masvidal was riding a wave of success. Born in Miami to Cuban and Peruvian parents, Masvidal grew up in a tough neighborhood where fighting wasn't just a sport, it was survival. He started his professional MMA career in 2003, grinding through smaller promotions before reaching the UFC. For years, he was a solid fighter, but never quite broke through to superstardom. That changed dramatically in 2019 with a 5-second knockout of Ben Askren, the fastest knockout in UFC history. Suddenly, at 35 years old, Masvidal was a star. The BMF belt fight, the celebrity interviews, the money fights, it all came together. He'd finally reached the pinnacle many thought would elude him. But with Jorge Masvidal, the line between fighter and street persona was always thin. He'd built his brand partly on the idea that he was authentic, real, someone who didn't play by conventional rules. And when he felt disrespected, that authenticity would be tested in ways no one anticipated. The tension began building after a fight with fellow UFC star Colby Covington in March 2022. The two had once been friends and training partners, but their relationship had deteriorated into one of the most bitter rivalries in the sport. The trash talk was relentless, personal, and ugly. Covington made comments about Masvidal's family, his ex-wife, and his children. In the fight itself, Covington won decisively by unanimous decision. For Masvidal, the loss was more than just professional. It felt personal. What happened next would shock even those familiar with MMA's sometimes volatile culture. It was the evening of March 21st, 2022, just 2 weeks after the fight. Colby Covington was leaving Poppy Steak, a restaurant in Miami Beach, when a figure approached him from behind. According to multiple witnesses and surveillance footage, Jorge Masvidal, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and surgical mask, confronted Covington outside the establishment. Words were exchanged, brief and heated. Then Masvidal struck Covington twice in the face. The attack was quick, and Masvidal fled the scene immediately, leaving Covington with visible injuries, including what would later be described as a fractured tooth and a brain injury that prosecutors would scrutinize carefully. The investigation didn't take long. Surveillance cameras had captured portions of the incident, and witnesses came forward. Within hours, law enforcement had identified Masvidal as the suspect. He turned himself in the following day, but not before the story had exploded across social media and sports news. Here was a professional fighter, trained in how to inflict damage, allegedly using those skills outside the legal boundaries of sanctioned competition. The charges were significant: aggravated battery with a mask and criminal mischief. The mask detail elevated the charge because it showed premeditation, an intent to conceal identity while committing the act. Masvidal's legal team prepared for battle. The defense strategy would center on several points: the extent of Covington's claimed injuries, whether Masvidal's actions constituted aggravated battery or something less serious, and the context of the provocation. Prosecutors, meanwhile, painted a picture of a professional fighter who'd taken street justice into his own hands, attacking someone from behind in a premeditated assault. Covington's team pushed the narrative hard, emphasizing the seriousness of being attacked by someone with Masvidal's training and skill. The legal proceedings dragged on for over a year, with both sides negotiating and preparing for potential trial. In April 2023, Masvidal reached a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to misdemeanor battery, with the more serious aggravated battery charge being dropped. The sentence reflected the negotiated nature of the resolution: time served, probation, community service, and mandated anger management courses. He was also required to stay away from Covington, with the protective order serving as a legal barrier between the two fighters. Additionally, Masvidal was responsible for paying restitution for the damages claimed by Covington. To some, the sentence seemed light for someone who'd allegedly ambushed another person with calculated intent. To others, it was appropriate, given that Covington's most serious injury claims couldn't be fully substantiated, and considering Masvidal's lack of serious prior criminal history. Where does Jorge Masvidal stand today? His fighting career, already on uncertain ground after losses to Covington and others, has essentially stalled. The UFC hasn't released him, but opportunities for big fights have dried up. The incident became a cautionary tale in the MMA community about the consequences of taking fight world beefs into the real world. Masvidal himself has spoken about the incident in interviews, sometimes with a tone suggesting he doesn't regret standing up for himself, other times acknowledging he could have handled things differently. The probationary conditions remain in effect, and any violation could result in much harsher consequences. This case highlights something we see repeatedly in combat sports: the challenge of turning off the fighter mentality when the cage door closes. Jorge Masvidal built a career and brand on being genuine, on being street, on not backing down. But authenticity without boundaries can become a liability. The streets have different rules than the Octagon, and the consequences are often far more severe. Masvidal learned that lesson the hard way, in front of cameras, in courtrooms, and in the permanent record that will follow him long after his fighting days end. The question that lingers is whether that lesson came too late. Number 3. Jason Miller. Jason Miller. If you followed mixed martial arts in the 2000s and early 2010s, you knew Mayhem, the Mohawk, the wild personality, the MTV show Bully Beatdown, the seemingly endless charisma. He was the fighter who could sell a fight with his mouth as effectively as he could with his skills. Imagine watching someone with that much potential, that much natural ability to entertain and compete, slowly spiral downward in a series of incidents that would transform him from beloved personality to cautionary tale. This is the story of how mental health struggles, substance issues, and increasingly erratic behavior led Jason Miller into a legal nightmare that's still unfolding. To understand how far Miller fell, you need to understand how high he once stood. Born in 1980 in North Carolina, Miller was a talented wrestler who transitioned into MMA during the sport's early growth period. He fought in multiple major organizations, including the UFC, Strikeforce, and Dream. His fighting style was entertaining, his personality was magnetic, and opportunities flowed. The MTV show made him a crossover star, someone recognizable even to people who didn't follow MMA closely. But behind the scenes, friends and colleagues had begun noticing troubling signs. The behavior that seemed wild and fun on camera was starting to seem less like entertainment and more like symptoms of something deeper. The first major legal incident came in 2011, when Miller was arrested for vandalizing a tattoo parlor in California. The details were bizarre. He allegedly destroyed property and fought with police officers who responded to the scene. The charges were eventually dropped, but it was a warning sign that many in the MMA community noted with concern. Then came 2013, and the pattern intensified. Miller was arrested for domestic violence after an incident at his home. The charges were serious, and the details painted a picture of someone whose grip on stability was weakening. But this was just the beginning of a descent that would shock even those who'd witnessed the earlier incidents. The year 2014 marked a turning point into truly disturbing territory. In October of that year, Miller was arrested again, this time for breaking into a church in Orange County, California. But this wasn't a simple property crime. According to police reports, Miller had barricaded himself inside the church and was found naked, covered in graffiti that he'd apparently spray painted on himself. When officers arrived and tried to communicate with him, his behavior was described as extremely agitated and disconnected from reality. It took multiple officers to subdue and arrest him. The image of the once charismatic fighter, naked and incoherent in a defaced church, became a symbol of how completely things had unraveled. Mental health professionals who reviewed the case later would point to clear signs of a psychiatric crisis, possibly exacerbated by substance use. Miller was hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation, but the legal charges remained: vandalism, breaking and entering, resisting arrest. The MMA community watched in horror as someone they'd known as entertaining and talented clearly struggled with demons that were now impossible to ignore. But Miller's legal troubles were far from over. The pattern continued with arrests in subsequent years for various charges including assault, domestic incidents, and violations of protective orders. Each arrest seemed to reveal someone further removed from the person fans had once cheered. Perhaps the most serious charges came in 2018, when Miller was arrested on multiple counts involving domestic violence and violation of protective orders. The details revealed a pattern of behavior that prosecutors described as escalating and dangerous. Victims testified about fear for their safety. The court proceedings revealed documentation of mental health issues, substance struggles, and a pattern of non-compliance with court-ordered treatment programs. Miller's defense team attempted to emphasize his need for treatment over incarceration, but the pattern of repeated offenses made that argument increasingly difficult. In 2019, Miller pleaded no contest to several charges. The sentence was significant: jail time followed by probation with strict conditions, including mandatory mental health treatment, substance abuse programs, and protective orders preventing contact with victims. But compliance proved challenging. Subsequent violations led to additional jail time. As of the most recent reports, Miller has cycled through the system multiple times, with periods of incarceration followed by release, followed by new violations or charges. It's a pattern that experts in criminal justice and mental health recognize all too well. Someone caught in a cycle they seem unable to break. Where is Jason Mayhem Miller today? The answer is complicated. Court records show ongoing legal issues and probationary conditions. Social media posts from Miller himself occasionally surface, ranging from seemingly lucid reflections to concerning rants that suggest continuing struggles. The MMA community has largely moved on, with Miller's name becoming a reference point for cautionary tales about mental health and the dangers of untreated psychiatric conditions combined with the pressures of fighting careers. Some former colleagues have tried to help, offering support and resources, but the challenges Miller faces go beyond what friendship alone can solve. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about mental health in combat sports. Was Miller's decline preventable? Should the organizations that profited from his personality have intervened earlier? What responsibility do we have to fighters when their entertaining quirks become symptoms of serious illness? Jason Miller's story doesn't have a neat resolution because it's still ongoing, still unfolding in courtrooms and treatment facilities. What we're left with is the tragedy of watching someone with so much potential become trapped in a cycle that's destroyed the life they once had. The mohawk and the smile are gone, replaced by mugshots and court appearances, and somewhere in that transformation is a lesson about the price of untreated mental illness and the long shadow it casts over everything it touches. Number 4. Charles Bennett. Charles Bennett. Even by the standards of mixed martial arts, where colorful personalities are common, Crazy Horse stood out. The dreadlocks, the unpredictable fighting style, the ability to create chaos both in and out of competition. For years, Bennett was the wild card of MMA, the fighter who could steal a show with a knockout or a confrontation, sometimes both in the same event. But imagine a personality that explosively exists without boundaries or consequences, and you begin to understand how Bennett's story would inevitably lead to courtrooms and serious legal jeopardy. This is the story of how a fighter's inability to control his impulses led to a pattern of criminal behavior that ultimately resulted in significant prison time. To understand Charles Bennett's legal troubles, you need to understand his background. Born in 1979, Bennett came up fighting in the rough and tumble world of early MMA, when the sport was still finding its identity. He fought in major organizations including Pride, UFC, and numerous smaller promotions. His fighting style was aggressive and entertaining, but it was his personality that made him memorable. Bennett seemed to live life at maximum intensity all the time. That made for great television, but terrible decision-making outside the cage. The warning signs were there early, with Bennett accumulating arrests for various offenses throughout his fighting career, but nothing that resulted in serious prison time. That pattern of avoiding major consequences may have contributed to the escalation that was coming. The incidents that would ultimately lead to Bennett's most serious legal troubles began accumulating in the 2010s. There were assault charges, domestic violence allegations, and various other encounters with law enforcement that painted a picture of someone who viewed violence as a solution to conflicts regardless of context. One particularly disturbing incident occurred in 2017 in Florida, where Bennett was charged with domestic violence and aggravated assault after an incident involving a partner. According to police reports, the assault included threats made with a weapon, escalating what might have been a verbal dispute into something far more serious. Bennett was arrested, but the case's resolution was delayed as he continued to fight professionally and move between jurisdictions. Then came the incident that would finally result in serious consequences. In 2018, Bennett was involved in an altercation at a gym in Tallahassee, Florida. The details were troubling. According to witnesses and surveillance footage, Bennett became enraged during what should have been a routine training session. The confrontation escalated physically, with Bennett allegedly attacking another individual in a manner that went well beyond any sporting context. What made this incident different from previous encounters was the severity of the assault and the clear documentation of Bennett's actions. Multiple witnesses came forward, and the evidence was overwhelming. Bennett was arrested and charged with aggravated battery. The legal process revealed a pattern that prosecutors used to devastating effect. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. Court documents showed Bennett's extensive history of violent encounters, failed anger management programs, and violations of previous probationary terms. The prosecution argued that Bennett represented a clear danger to the community, someone whose inability to control violent impulses made incarceration necessary. Bennett's defense team attempted to contextualize his behavior, pointing to the culture of combat sports and arguing that their client needed treatment rather than prison. But the pattern was undeniable, and the judge had significant discretion given Bennett's prior record. The sentence came down in 2019, and it was significant: multiple years in state prison. The exact length would depend on various factors, including behavior during incarceration and successful completion of mandated programs, but the reality was clear. Charles Bennett would spend substantial time behind bars. For someone whose identity had been built around being a fighter, around physical freedom and spontaneous intensity, the structured environment of prison represented a complete inversion of everything he'd known. The MMA community reacted with a mix of sadness and resignation. Many felt Bennett had been heading toward this outcome for years, that it was less a matter of if than when. During his incarceration, Bennett has occasionally made news through letters or phone calls to MMA media members. Some of these communications have shown reflection and acknowledgement of past mistakes. Others have revealed the same impulsive, sometimes paranoid thinking patterns that contributed to his legal troubles in the first place. Prison officials have reported both disciplinary issues and periods of compliance, suggesting Bennett struggles with the structure and limitations of incarceration. As of the most recent information, Bennett is still serving his sentence with the possibility of parole in the future, depending on behavior and completion of required programs. What does Charles Bennett's case teach us? Perhaps it's a reminder that talent and personality can only carry you so far when behavior patterns remain unaddressed. Bennett had opportunities that most fighters never receive. He fought in major organizations, appeared on television, and built a following. But without the internal controls necessary to navigate life outside the cage, those opportunities became irrelevant. The chaos that made him entertaining to watch ultimately made him dangerous to be around. And in the end, society made a determination that protection of the public required removing Bennett from the community. Whether prison time will ultimately help Bennett develop the impulse control he lacked remains to be seen. What's certain is that the crazy horse persona, fun in highlight reels, proved devastating in real life. And now Bennett has years behind bars to contemplate the difference between those two realities. Number 5. Reza Madadi. Reza Madadi. To UFC fans in Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, Madadi was a recognizable name. The Iranian-Swedish fighter had earned respect in the lightweight division, known for his grappling skills and his powerful ground game. But imagine building a successful fighting career, earning the admiration of fans and the respect of peers, and then throwing it all away in a single night of catastrophically poor judgment. This is the story of how Reza Madadi went from prospect fighter to convicted felon, and how one decision changed the trajectory of his entire life. Before we get to the crime that would define Madadi's legacy, let's understand who he was. Born in Iran in 1984, Madadi moved to Sweden as a child. Growing up in the Stockholm area, he found martial arts and quickly showed talent, particularly in wrestling and grappling. His professional MMA career began in 2007, and within a few years, he'd caught the attention of UFC scouts. Making it to the UFC is a dream for fighters worldwide, and Madadi achieved that goal in 2012. His first fight in the organization was a successful debut, and the future seemed bright. He was representing the growing European MMA scene, building a following, and earning decent money for his fights. Life was good. But away from the cameras and training mats, Madadi was making connections and choices that would prove disastrous. The incident that would change everything occurred in the early morning hours of March 17, 2013, in Gothenburg, Sweden. A commercial building housing several businesses was broken into. The method of entry showed planning. Security measures were bypassed, and the perpetrators moved quickly to their targets. Multiple locations within the building were hit, including a jewelry store. When police arrived at the scene, they found a situation that would lead to one of the strangest arrests in Swedish MMA history. Among the suspects detained near the scene was Reza Madadi, active UFC fighter and Swedish sports figure. The shock rippled through the MMA community instantly. The investigation revealed details that made Madadi's involvement undeniable. Surveillance footage showed individuals matching descriptions of Madadi and his co-defendants at the scene. Physical evidence tied them to the break-in. Most damaging was the discovery of stolen property connected to the crime during searches related to the suspects. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence pointed to active participation in a planned theft operation. Prosecutors built a case around the coordinated nature of the crime, suggesting premeditation and shared intent among the participants. Madadi's legal team would attempt various defensive strategies, but the evidence was substantial, and the witnesses were credible. The trial proceeded with intense media coverage in Sweden. Here was a professional athlete, someone who'd achieved success through legitimate means, caught up in criminal activity that seemed completely at odds with his public persona. Prosecutors described Madadi as an active participant who'd used his physical capabilities to aid in the commission of the crimes. The value of the stolen goods was significant, elevating the seriousness of the charges. Defense attorneys attempted to minimize Madadi's role, suggesting perhaps he'd been influenced by others or that his participation was limited. But the evidence presented made those arguments difficult to sustain. Multiple witnesses, surveillance footage, and the recovery of stolen property created a compelling narrative of guilt. In March 2014, approximately 1 year after the incident, the verdict came down: guilty of aggravated theft. The sentence was significant under Swedish law: 1 year in prison. For a professional athlete in the prime of his career, this represented a devastating blow. The UFC immediately suspended Madadi and eventually released him from his contract. Sponsorships disappeared. The reputation he'd built over years of training and competition was shattered in a single night of criminal activity. Madadi would serve his sentence in Swedish facilities, removed from training, competition, and the life he'd known. The fall from prospect fighter to inmate was complete. Serving time in Sweden's correctional system, Madadi reportedly cooperated with authorities and maintained relatively good behavior. He would later speak in interviews about the experience, describing it as a wake-up call and expressing regret for his actions. Upon release in 2015, Madadi faced the challenge of rebuilding a life and career that had been destroyed by his own choices. The UFC was no longer an option. Sponsors weren't interested. But the regional MMA circuit in Europe eventually gave him opportunities to compete again. He fought several times post-release, with mixed results, never regaining the momentum he'd had before the conviction. Where is Reza Madadi today? He continues to compete occasionally in regional promotions, primarily in Europe. His record shows wins and losses, but his name carries the permanent mark of the conviction. In interviews and social media, Madadi has attempted to frame his past as a mistake he's learned from, emphasizing personal growth and changed perspective. The Swedish MMA community has largely moved on, with Madadi becoming a cautionary example rather than a celebrated figure. Some have offered support for his redemption efforts, while others maintain that the criminal actions revealed character flaws that can't be fully erased. This case represents a particular type of tragedy, the self-inflicted destruction of opportunity. Reza Madadi had worked his entire life to reach the UFC. The training, the sacrifices, the discipline required to compete at that level are immense. And yet, for reasons that remain difficult to fully understand, he participated in a crime that guaranteed losing everything he'd worked for. Was it financial pressure? Association with the wrong people? A moment of catastrophically poor judgment? Perhaps all of these factors played roles. What we know for certain is that one night of criminal activity erased years of legitimate achievement, and the prison sentence, while served and completed, became a life sentence in terms of reputation and lost opportunity. Reza Madadi is free today, but he'll never be free from the consequences of what he did in March 2013. Number 6. Paul Kelly. Paul Kelly. For fans of British MMA, Kelly was a familiar name in the 2000s and early 2010s, a talented lightweight fighter with solid skills and the toughness you'd expect from someone who came up fighting in the UK's regional circuit. He competed in the UFC, fought in venues across Europe, and built a respectable record. Imagine having that level of success, that level of recognition in a competitive field, and then losing it all due to criminal activity that had nothing to do with sport. This is the story of how Paul Kelly went from professional fighter to convicted participant in a violent criminal enterprise. Before the incident that would end his fighting career and land him in prison, Paul Kelly seemed to be living the life many fighters dream of. Born in 1982 in Denton, England, Kelly came up in the rough and tumble world of British MMA when the sport was still establishing legitimacy in the UK. He turned professional in 2005 and quickly showed talent, particularly in his striking and overall toughness. By 2008, he'd earned a contract with the UFC, a significant achievement for any fighter, but especially for someone from the UK at a time when British fighters were less common in the organization. Kelly fought several times in the UFC between 2008 and 2010, posting a respectable record and earning recognition as a solid competitor. When the UFC released him in 2010, he continued fighting in European promotions, maintaining his status as a professional athlete. But away from the cage, Kelly's associations and activities were heading in a very different direction. The criminal investigation that would ultimately ensnare Kelly began in 2011, when police in the Manchester area started tracking a series of violent incidents connected to organized criminal activity. The case involved multiple individuals engaged in various illegal enterprises, including extortion, assault, and violent intimidation. Detectives built their case slowly, gathering evidence through surveillance, witness statements, and documentation of incidents over several months. When arrests finally came in 2012, the list of suspects included a name that shocked the British MMA community: Paul Kelly, professional fighter. The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit violent disorder, participating in organized criminal activity, and assault. The evidence presented at trial painted a picture very different from Kelly's public persona as a professional athlete. Prosecutors described Kelly as an active participant in a group that used violence and intimidation to achieve criminal goals. The specifics included incidents where Kelly allegedly participated in assaults on individuals targeted by the organization. His fighting skills, developed through years of training for legitimate competition, were allegedly employed in criminal enterprises. Witnesses testified about acts of violence, and evidence was presented connecting Kelly to multiple incidents over a significant time period. This wasn't a case of a one-time mistake or poor judgment in a single moment. The prosecution's case suggested ongoing, voluntary participation in organized criminal behavior. Kelly's defense team attempted to challenge the prosecution's narrative, but the evidence was substantial. Witness testimony was corroborated by surveillance and other physical evidence. Multiple co-defendants were also facing serious charges, and some provided testimony that implicated Kelly further. The trial proceeded over several weeks, with detailed presentations of the evidence gathered during the investigation. For observers from the MMA community who followed the case, the details were shocking. This was a professional athlete who'd competed at the highest levels, now facing accusations of using those skills in violent criminal activities. The contrast between his legitimate fighting career and the alleged criminal behavior couldn't have been starker. In 2013, the verdict came down: guilty. Paul Kelly was convicted of conspiracy to commit violent disorder and related charges. The sentence reflected the serious nature of the crimes: 4.5 years in prison. For a fighter whose career was already in its later stages, this effectively ended any possibility of continuing in professional MMA. Kelly was 31 years old when sentenced, theoretically still in fighting age, but the years in prison would mean missing the remainder of his prime athletic years. The UFC and other major promotions would never consider someone with such a serious criminal conviction. Sponsors, training opportunities, everything associated with a legitimate fighting career evaporated instantly. Kelly served his sentence in British prisons, with little public information emerging during his incarceration. The MMA community largely moved on, with Kelly's name becoming another cautionary tale about fighters whose lives outside the cage derailed promising careers. Upon release several years later, Kelly faced the challenge of rebuilding a life with a serious criminal conviction on his record. Fighting professionally was no longer realistic. Finding employment with his background would be challenging. The life he'd known as a professional athlete was gone completely. Where is Paul Kelly today? Information is limited, as Kelly has maintained a low profile since his release from prison. He has not attempted to return to professional fighting, and his name rarely appears in MMA discussions except as a historical reference. Some reports suggest he's attempted to find work outside of fighting, but details are scarce. What's clear is that the criminal conviction permanently altered his life's trajectory. The 4.5 years in prison represented just the formal sentence. The true life sentence was the loss of career, reputation, and opportunity. This case forces us to consider the question of why someone with legitimate success in a difficult field would risk everything through criminal activity. Was it financial pressure? Bad associations? A belief that he wouldn't get caught? Perhaps all of these factors played roles. What we know is that Paul Kelly made choices that transformed him from respected professional athlete to convicted criminal. The skills he'd developed for competition were allegedly misused for violent criminal purposes, and the consequences were total and permanent. Today, Paul Kelly's name serves primarily as a warning to other fighters about the importance of the choices made outside the cage. Because no matter how successful you are in competition, criminal behavior can erase it all in an instant. Number 7. Rob Broughton. Rob Broughton. In British MMA circles, Broughton was known as a heavyweight with decent skills and the tenacity to compete at a high level. Standing 6'4" and weighing in at around 250 pounds, he was an imposing figure who'd fought in cage rage and eventually earned a contract with the UFC in 2009. But imagine that physical presence, that capacity for controlled violence in sport, being used in an entirely different context. This is the story of how Rob Broughton went from UFC heavyweight to convicted participant in a criminal act that would send him to prison and permanently destroy his fighting career. To understand where things went wrong for Broughton, we need to look at who he was before the incident. Born in 1981 in the United Kingdom, Broughton came up fighting in the British MMA scene during a period when the sport was working to establish legitimacy in Europe. He wasn't the most technical fighter, but he was tough, durable, and willing to take on anyone. His professional career began in 2005, and he steadily worked his way up through regional promotions. The UFC contract in 2009 represented the peak of his career. He fought twice in the organization, going 1 win and 1 loss, which was respectable for a British heavyweight at that time. When the UFC released him in 2010, Broughton returned to fighting in European promotions, continuing to compete professionally and earn money through the sport. On the surface, everything seemed to be proceeding as expected for a journeyman fighter working to extend his career. But in 2011, Broughton's life took a dark turn that had nothing to do with sanctioned fighting. The incident occurred in Manchester, England, and the details would shock those who knew Broughton as a professional athlete. According to police reports and witness testimony, Broughton was involved in a violent attack on an individual under circumstances that went far beyond any legitimate self-defense claim. The victim suffered serious injuries requiring hospitalization. Multiple witnesses came forward, and physical evidence tied Broughton to the scene. This wasn't a bar fight or a momentary loss of temper in an ambiguous situation. The evidence suggested a targeted attack characterized by the use of excessive force against someone unable to adequately defend themselves. The investigation moved forward quickly. Detectives interviewed witnesses, collected physical evidence, and reviewed surveillance footage from the area where the incident occurred. Broughton was identified and arrested within days. The charges were serious, causing grievous bodily harm with intent, one of the more serious assault charges under British law. When details of the case became public, the British MMA community reacted with shock. Here was a UFC veteran, someone who'd competed at the highest level of the sport, now facing charges related to a street assault. The contrast between controlled violence in the cage and criminal violence outside it was stark and disturbing. As the legal process unfolded, prosecutors built their case around the severity of the injuries inflicted and the circumstances of the attack. They emphasized Broughton's training as a professional fighter, arguing that his skills and physical capabilities made the assault particularly dangerous and the injuries particularly severe. The victim's testimony described the attack and the lasting impact of the injuries sustained. Medical evidence corroborated the seriousness of the harm caused. Broughton's defense team attempted to present mitigating factors, but the evidence of what occurred was substantial and difficult to challenge. The question wasn't whether Broughton had committed the act, but rather what circumstances surrounded it and what sentence would be appropriate. In 2012, Rob Broughton was convicted of causing grievous bodily harm. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted Broughton's background as a trained fighter and the responsibility that came with possessing those skills. The sentence was significant: 3.5 years in prison. For a fighter who was 31 years old at the time of sentencing, this represented the end of any realistic fighting career. The years in prison would take away what remained of his athletic prime. No major promotion would ever consider hiring someone with such a serious, violent conviction. The career that Broughton had spent years building was over, destroyed by one incident of criminal violence. Broughton served his sentence in British correctional facilities. During his incarceration, there was little public information about his status or behavior. The MMA world moved on quickly, with Broughton's name fading from discussion except as an occasional reference in cautionary conversations about fighters who destroyed their careers through criminal behavior. The contrast between his identity as a professional athlete and his new reality as an inmate was complete. Everything he'd worked for, the training, the fights, the recognition, became irrelevant in the face of the conviction and imprisonment. Upon release from prison, Broughton faced the challenge that all convicted felons face: rebuilding a life with a serious criminal record. For someone whose only professional skill was fighting, the options were extremely limited. Major MMA promotions wouldn't consider him. Smaller regional shows might theoretically give him opportunities, but even those organizations typically avoid fighters with serious violent convictions outside the sport. Finding employment outside of fighting with his background would also prove difficult. The 3.5 years in prison was just the formal sentence. The real-life sentence was the permanent closure of doors that would never reopen. Where is Rob Broughton today? Information is scarce, as Broughton has maintained an extremely low profile since his release from prison. He has not returned to professional fighting in any documented capacity. His social media presence is minimal to non-existent. For all practical purposes, Broughton has disappeared from public life. What we're left with is the permanent record of what occurred. A professional fighter who used his skills in a criminal assault, suffered conviction and imprisonment, and lost everything he'd worked for in the process. His career statistics remain in databases, but they're artifacts of a life that ended when he made the choices that led to that assault in 2011. The Broughton case serves as a reminder of the responsibility that comes with being trained in violence. Professional fighters develop skills that can cause serious harm. In the controlled environment of sanctioned competition, those skills are impressive and entertaining. But outside that context, they become weapons, and using them criminally carries severe consequences. Rob Broughton learned that lesson in the harshest possible way. The UFC veteran became just another inmate, just another cautionary tale. And today, his name is remembered not for his fights in the cage, but for the criminal act that destroyed everything he'd built. Number 8, Jeremy Jackson. Jeremy Jackson. Wait, you might be thinking, wasn't that the name of the actor who played Hobie on Baywatch? You'd be correct, but this is a different Jeremy Jackson entirely. This Jeremy Jackson was a mixed martial arts fighter who competed primarily in smaller regional promotions in the United States during the 2000s. But imagine sharing a name with a celebrity, perhaps thinking that might give you some extra recognition, only to become known instead for a crime so disturbing that your name becomes associated with one of the darker stories in MMA's criminal history. This is the story of how fighter Jeremy Jackson became a convicted offender whose actions shocked even those familiar with the sometimes troubled world of combat sports. Before we get to the crime that would define Jackson's legacy, let's establish who he was as a fighter. Born in the early 1980s, Jackson was a heavyweight and light heavyweight competitor who fought in various regional promotions, primarily in California, during the mid to late 2000s. His record was mixed, with wins and losses that placed him in the journeyman category, someone who was a professional but never broke through to the major organizations. He wasn't a name that casual MMA fans would recognize, but within the regional circuit, he was known as a tough competitor willing to take fights on short notice. Outside the cage, Jackson kept a relatively low profile, which made what would come next all the more shocking to those who knew him. The incident that would destroy Jackson's life occurred in 2009 in Orange County, California. The details are disturbing and require careful handling. Jackson was arrested and charged with breaking into a residence and committing an assault of a nature so serious that it involved charges related to forced contact of an intimate nature. The victim was a woman who was home alone when Jackson allegedly broke in. According to police reports and the victim's testimony, Jackson used force to enter the residence and then attack the victim. The assault was interrupted when someone else arrived at the location, causing Jackson to flee the scene. But the damage had been done, both to the victim and to any future Jackson might have imagined for himself. The investigation moved quickly because the victim was able to provide a detailed account and physical description. Additionally, evidence collected at the scene would later tie Jackson to the crime. Within days, police identified Jackson as the suspect and arrested him. The charges were among the most serious in the criminal code: breaking and entering with intent to commit a felony, assault with intent to commit a serious offense against bodily autonomy, and related charges. When news of the arrest spread through the MMA community, the reaction was one of horror and disbelief. Crimes of this nature are universally condemned, and Jackson's status as a fighter made the case particularly disturbing to those who followed the sport. The legal process revealed the strength of the prosecution's case. The victim's testimony was detailed and consistent. Physical evidence collected from the scene was processed and analyzed. DNA evidence would later play a role in tying Jackson definitively to the crime. Jackson's defense attorneys faced an extremely difficult situation. The evidence was substantial, and the nature of the charges meant that any trial would be emotionally charged and heavily weighted against the defendant. Negotiations between defense and prosecution occurred, but given the seriousness of the charges and the strength of the evidence, the defense had limited leverage. In 2010, Jeremy Jackson entered a plea agreement. Rather than face trial on all charges, he pleaded guilty to reduced charges that still carried significant prison time. The sentence was severe: 16 years in state prison. For someone in his late 20s at the time of sentencing, this meant Jackson would likely be in his mid-40s before having any possibility of release. The courtroom during sentencing reportedly heard victim impact statements describing the trauma and lasting harm caused by Jackson's actions. The judge, in delivering the sentence, emphasized the gravity of the crime and the need to protect the community from someone who'd committed such a serious violation. Jeremy Jackson entered the California prison system to begin serving his sentence. During his incarceration, there has been virtually no public information about his status, behavior, or any efforts toward rehabilitation. The MMA community, such as it was regarding a regional fighter most fans had never heard of, completely moved on. Jackson's fighting record remains in databases, but it's a footnote to a story that's primarily about the crime he committed. The victim, meanwhile, has had to live with the trauma of what occurred, a burden that extends far beyond Jackson's prison sentence. As of current information, Jeremy Jackson remains incarcerated in the California prison system, serving the 16-year sentence imposed in 2010. Depending on behavior and California's complex system for calculating actual time served, he may eventually face release, but that remains years in the future. When and if that release occurs, Jackson will face life as a registered offender with restrictions on where he can live and work, mandatory check-ins with law enforcement, and the permanent stigma of his conviction. The life he had as a professional fighter, modest as it was, is completely gone and can never be recovered. This case represents one of the most disturbing in MMA's criminal history, not because of Jackson's prominence as a fighter, he had none, but because of the nature of the crime itself. It serves as a reminder that athletic ability and training exist separately from character and moral judgment. Jackson had the physical skills to compete professionally in one of the world's most demanding sports, but those skills, that physicality, were used in service of a crime that destroyed lives, both the victims and his own. There's no redemption arc here, no story of learning and growth. Just a stark reminder that some choices have permanent, devastating consequences, and Jeremy Jackson's name, once associated with regional MMA competition, is now permanently linked to a crime that removed him from society and placed him in a category of offenders whose actions can never be fully reconciled or forgiven. Number 9. Pietro Menga. Pietro Menga. The name might not ring bells for casual MMA fans, but in Brazilian mixed martial arts circles, particularly in the regional scene, Menga was a recognizable figure in the late 2000s. A heavyweight fighter with a background in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he represented the ground fighting tradition that Brazil is famous for in the MMA world. But imagine being part of that proud tradition, part of a fighting culture that emphasizes discipline and respect, and then becoming involved in something so far removed from those values that it ends your career and your freedom. This is the story of how Pietro Menga went from promising fighter to convicted criminal in a case that shocked Brazil's MMA community. Before the incident that would change his life forever, Pietro Menga seemed to be on a positive trajectory. Born in Brazil in the early 1980s, Menga trained in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from a young age, eventually earning his black belt and transitioning into mixed martial arts. His professional career began in the mid-2000s, fighting primarily in Brazilian regional promotions. His record showed promise, with several wins that demonstrated solid grappling skills and improving striking. In Brazil's competitive MMA scene, Menga was working his way up, hoping to eventually catch the attention of larger organizations. He had training partners, sponsors, and the respect of his peers. The future looked like it held potential for someone willing to work hard and remain dedicated. Then came 2008, and everything changed. The incident occurred in Rio de Janeiro, and the details would stun those who knew Menga. According to the police reports and subsequent court documents, Menga was involved in a violent robbery. The circumstances involved multiple perpetrators targeting a victim in a planned attack. The victim was physically assaulted, property was stolen, and the level of violence used was described by prosecutors as excessive and cruel. Witnesses came forward, and physical evidence tied Menga and his co-defendants to the crime. This wasn't a spontaneous act, or a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence suggested planning, coordination, and willingness to use violence to achieve criminal goals. The investigation by Rio de Janeiro police moved forward systematically. Detectives interviewed witnesses, processed physical evidence, and tracked down the suspects. When Menga was arrested, the charges were serious: armed robbery, assault, and participation in a criminal organization. The fact that he was a professional fighter became a significant aspect of the case. Prosecutors argued that Menga's training made him particularly dangerous, and that his physical capabilities were used to facilitate the crime. The contrast between his public persona as an athlete and his alleged role in violent criminal activity was stark. Media coverage in Brazil highlighted the case as an example of a fighter who'd gone completely off track. The legal proceedings revealed the strength of the case against Menga. Multiple witnesses provided consistent testimony about what occurred. Physical evidence connected Menga to the scene. Co-defendants provided statements that implicated Menga as an active participant rather than a peripheral figure. Menga's defense team attempted various strategies, but the accumulated evidence was substantial. The trial proceeded with significant media attention in Brazil, where MMA has a huge following and cases involving fighters attract considerable interest. For the Brazilian MMA community, the trial was embarrassing, a reminder that not everyone who trains in martial arts upholds the values those arts are supposed to teach. In 2009, Pietro Menga was convicted on multiple charges related to the robbery. The sentence was severe by Brazilian standards, over 10 years in prison. For a fighter who was in his mid-20s at the time, This represented the complete destruction of his athletic career. The years in prison would take away any possibility of competing professionally again. No promotion in Brazil or anywhere else would consider hiring someone with such a serious, violent conviction. Sponsors and training affiliations disappeared immediately. Everything Menga had worked for in martial arts was erased by his participation in criminal activity. Menga entered Brazil's prison system to serve his sentence. Information about his time in prison is limited, as Brazilian media moved on to other stories, and the MMA community largely forgot about him. Brazil's prisons are notoriously difficult, with overcrowding and violence being common. For someone like Menga, his background as a fighter might have provided some protection, or it might have made him a target. What we know is that he served a significant portion of his sentence before eventually being released several years later. The details of his release, whether through serving his full term or through Brazil's complex parole system, are not widely documented. Where is Pietro Menga today? Information is scarce, which may be intentional on Menga's part. There are no records of him attempting to return to professional fighting. His name occasionally appears in discussions about fighters who destroyed their careers through criminal behavior, but beyond that, he's effectively disappeared from public life. Some reports suggest he remained in Brazil after release, but details about his current circumstances are unknown. What's certain is that the promising fighter who competed in regional shows in the 2000s is gone, replaced by someone with a serious criminal record trying to navigate life after prison. The Menga case serves as a reminder that talent and opportunity mean nothing if character and judgment are absent. Brazil has produced some of the greatest fighters in MMA history, athletes who've demonstrated the discipline and dedication that martial arts training is supposed to instill. Pietro Menga had access to that same tradition, that same culture of excellence, but somewhere along the way, he made choices that led him into violent criminal activity. The robbery he participated in destroyed his victims' sense of security and trust, and it destroyed Menga's future, trading years of freedom and a professional fighting career for a prison cell and a permanent criminal record. Today, Pietro Menga's name is a footnote in Brazilian MMA history, remembered not for anything he accomplished in the cage, but for what he did outside it. And that's perhaps the saddest legacy any fighter can leave behind. Number 10. Lambert Akhiyadov. Lambert Akhiyadov. The name comes from Chechnya, a region that's produced numerous tough, skilled fighters who've competed in MMA organizations around the world. Akhiyadov was part of that tradition, a heavyweight fighter who competed in Russian promotions during the 2000s and early 2010s. But imagine coming from a region with a complicated history of violence and conflict, carrying that background into a fighting career, and then becoming involved in criminal activity that would make international headlines. This is the story of how Lambert Akhiyadov went from regional MMA fighter to convicted participant in a crime that shocked Europe and highlighted the dark intersection between combat sports and organized crime. To understand Akhiyadov's story, we need context about his background. Born in Chechnya in the 1980s, Akhiyadov grew up during a period of intense conflict in the region. The Chechen Wars created a generation of young men familiar with violence and hardship. For some, martial arts and combat sports provided a legitimate outlet and path forward. Akhiyadov pursued fighting, developing skills in Sambo and other martial arts before transitioning to mixed martial arts. His professional career began in the mid-2000s, competing in Russian regional promotions. He was a heavyweight with solid grappling skills and the toughness you'd expect from someone with his background. His record was respectable, showing wins against legitimate opponents, though he never broke through to major international organizations. The criminal case that would ensnare Akhiyadov developed in Europe in the early 2010s. European law enforcement agencies had been tracking organized criminal activities connected to networks operating across multiple countries. The investigation involved surveillance, wiretaps, and coordination between agencies in several nations. In 2013, the case reached a critical phase when arrests were made across Europe in a coordinated operation. Among those arrested was Lambert Akyatov, who was taken into custody in connection with serious charges related to organized criminal activity. The specifics involved allegations of participation in a network engaged in violent crime, extortion, and other serious offenses across international borders. The evidence presented by prosecutors painted a disturbing picture. Akyatov was allegedly not a peripheral figure, but an active participant in operations that involved violence and intimidation. His background as a trained fighter made him particularly valuable to the organization, according to investigators. Wiretapped communications, witness testimony, and financial records were used to build the case. The investigation revealed connections between Akyatov and other individuals involved in organized criminal enterprises. For observers following the case, it represented a troubling example of how fighting skills developed for sport could be exploited for criminal purposes. The case also highlighted concerns about connections between certain fighting networks and organized crime, particularly involving fighters from regions with strong organized crime presence. The legal proceedings were complex, involving multiple defendants and evidence from various countries. Akyatov's defense team attempted to challenge the prosecution's characterization of his role, but the accumulated evidence was substantial. Witnesses testified about incidents involving violence and intimidation. Financial records showed transactions that prosecutors argued demonstrated participation in criminal enterprises. The trial proceeded over many months, with detailed presentations of evidence gathered during the extensive investigation. Media coverage in Europe focused on the organized crime aspects, with Akyatov's background as a fighter being noted as relevant to his alleged role. In 2014, Lambert Akyatov was convicted on multiple charges related to organized criminal activity. The sentence was severe, over 15 years in prison. European prison sentences for organized crime involvement are typically substantial, reflecting the seriousness with which such activity is treated. For Akyatov, who was in his early 30s at the time of sentencing, this represented essentially the end of his fighting career and a significant portion of his life spent incarcerated. The conviction also meant that even after serving his sentence, he would face restrictions on travel and residence, effectively limiting his freedom long after release from prison. Akyatov entered the European prison system to begin serving his sentence. Information about his incarceration is limited, as privacy laws in European countries restrict details about inmates. The MMA community, particularly in Russia, was aware of the case, but Akyatov had never been prominent enough for his imprisonment to generate sustained interest. His fighting record remains in databases, showing his wins and losses in Russian regional promotions, but it's a footnote to a story that's primarily about organized crime rather than athletic competition. Where is Lambert Akyatov today? Based on the sentence imposed in 2014, he would still be serving his prison term in a European facility. The 15-year sentence means he wouldn't be eligible for release until the late 2020s at the earliest, and that would depend on behavior and whether he qualified for any early release programs available in the jurisdiction where he's imprisoned. When and if he's eventually released, Akyatov will face life as a convicted felon with an organized crime conviction, which carries particular stigma and restrictions. Any possibility of returning to professional fighting would be essentially non-existent. Immigration and travel restrictions would likely prevent him from moving freely across borders. The Akyatov case represents a particularly troubling intersection of combat sports and organized crime. It highlights concerns that law enforcement agencies have expressed about how fighting networks in certain regions can become connected to criminal organizations. Akyadov's skills as a fighter, developed through years of training, were allegedly employed not in legitimate competition, but in service of criminal enterprises. The investigation that led to his conviction required years of work by multiple law enforcement agencies across countries, demonstrating the complexity and seriousness of the criminal network he was allegedly part of. For the MMA community, cases like Akyadov's serve as reminders of the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between sport and the criminal elements that sometimes try to exploit fighting culture. Martial arts are supposed to teach discipline, respect, and self-control. But without those values genuinely internalized, the skills learned can become tools for harm rather than personal development. Lambert Akyadov had the physical capabilities to compete professionally in one of the world's most demanding sports. But according to European prosecutors and courts, he chose to use those capabilities in service of organized crime. And that choice has cost him his freedom, his career, and any possibility of the future he might have built through legitimate fighting. Today, Akyadov sits in a European prison, his name a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing martial arts skills to serve criminal purposes rather than athletic and personal growth.